It's time. Take roll by decreasing your
Hey, sorry about that, guys. I'm back. We had a little bit of an internet issue there. They're doing some construction on the house next door, so whenever they're doing construction, when they turn on the, when they turn on the saw, my internet starts popping out of place. So give me a second here. Let me just get everything back squared away. All right, we're back, good to go. We should still be up. Sorry about that. Anyway, like I said, we had the DK Survivor Tournament today, so if you're still alive, make sure you get your lineups in. There's also the $215 qualifier for the Fantasy Aces tournament tonight. So it's a smaller field, only 125 entries. Was lucky enough to pick up a ticket for that as well. So hopefully we'll have a really good night tonight. There's a couple potential weather issues I wanted to talk to you guys about. The Cubs and Cardinals game is definitely one that looks a little dicey. It's almost certain that we're going to have some delays in that game today. At the very least, probably a late start, and it could even be a postponement. Make sure you guys come back around 5:30. Our in-house meteorologist, Danielle Kozlowski, will have her weather report up. She has the graph. She shows you guys what's going on, and she gives you guys an idea of, what might work and what might not work. And I think that that's one of the games that you definitely want to consider. So if there are some guys that you're looking at in that Cubs and Cardinals game, just be careful, because there's a good chance that that one might not go off. There are 3 other games that have some rain issues. It doesn't look like they'll be postponed, but there could be some delays, which could be tough. And I'll show you why, because there are some pitchers in those games that most people are going to be targeting tonight. The 3 games that have problems are Washington at Philly, Cleveland at Baltimore, and Atlanta at Pittsburgh. Now, when we get into the pitching, you'll see that guys like Kluber, guys like Scherzer, guys like Liriano, those are all guys that people are going to be on tonight. Even in that Cardinals and Cubs game, Arrieta and Lackey are two of the guys that are, for better or worse, probably some of the better pitching options today. So that's 5 pitching options that we have tonight that are all in games that have some kind of rain or some kind of weather issue. And again, we don't really care if the game is delayed at the start, but if they go 2 or 3 or 4 innings and then there's a big long delay in the middle, if your pitcher doesn't come out to pitch the 5th or the 6th, he's not going to be eligible for a win. And he's obviously not going to get a lot of points for his innings bonus. He's not going to rack up a lot of strikeouts. And if you're paying $10,000 for some of these guys that we just mentioned, and they only go 4 innings for you, that's really going to hurt your lineup. So weather's going to be a concern tonight. If you're not going to be around at 5, 6, 7 o'clock before lineups lock to look at stuff, definitely don't play a lot of high volume today, because it could be one of those days where you get you get stuck with your pants down at lineup lock time. So you definitely want to make sure you're back here around 5:30. Wait for Danielle's report to come out, and make sure you listen to what she has to say. She's been on the money all season with this stuff. She's very good at her job, and she'll be able to help guide you through it. Looking at the Vegas lines, there's a lot of things that popped out to me at the Vegas lines today. For starters, the 2 biggest favorites on the day are Scherzer and Liriano. Scherzer is -210 against Philly. Liriano's going up against Atlanta. He's -200. When we talk about starting pitchers, you're going to see those are the 2 guys that are on the top of my list. And we'll talk about the pricing, because pricing is going to be big today. The way you build your lineups around these stud pitchers is going to determine whether or not you're able to go on and make some money tonight. Other stuff that I thought was kind of weird when I was looking at the Vegas lines, Mark Burley is a very big favorite today, -170 at home against Texas. Texas is a very lefty-heavy lineup, Burley being a left-handed pitcher. I'm assuming that's what it's from. Burley has been pitching pretty well lately, so I can see why he might be a little bit of a favorite, but -170 seemed a little high for me. He goes up against Nick Martinez. Martinez has been good this year, but again, Martinez is not really a huge stud pitcher that you got to worry about. So I guess that all kind of plays in together, but -170 seemed a little bit high to me. So definitely a game that you might want to take a look at. Burley could be a cheap guy that you can use in your GPPs, and the way that this is looking, it's probably not going to be the worst idea to look at some of those Toronto bats either. Moving on from there, Kluber is not a big favorite, which surprised me. Right now, he's actually stuck at a pick'em with Wei-Yin Chen from Baltimore. Chen has actually been sneaky good. He has actually been the winning pitcher on 3 moonshot winning rosters so far this season. Now, you probably wouldn't think that, because he's not somebody who we consider to be one of the studs. But again, the guy's made 12, 13 starts, and on 3 of those starts, if you had him, you had the winning. Well, on 3 of those starts, the winning roster in the moonshot had him on it. So that's a pretty good percentage. About 25% of the time, he's been one of the pitchers on a winning moonshot roster. And again, the moonshot is the largest field tournament that they have on DraftKings. 2,000 to 6,000 people every night. So if you can get 2,000 to 6,000 people every night, that's a pretty big deal that his name keeps popping up on the top. Again, I just found it interesting that Kluber is not that big a favorite today, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend or to use him tonight. But we'll talk about that when we get into pitching as well. There's another pretty good pitching matchup between Johnny Cueto and Noah Syndergaard. Right now, Cueto is a small favorite at -110, but it is a very low run line in that game at only 6.5. Obviously, we know the Mets offense has been putrid, so I would have expected Cueto to be a bigger favorite in that one. Syndergaard has been good. He had a couple bad starts, but he's also had a couple dominant starts. So this is another tough game to read on a day like today. One thing I did want to mention to you guys is today's a tough day for bats. There's obviously no game in Coors Field, which is something that I know people have mentioned in chat already this morning, and it's definitely something that makes things a little bit easier for us today. There's only 3 games with run totals of 8 runs or higher today. One is the Chicago White Sox against the Detroit Tigers. Tigers are favored. All those right-handed bats going up against Jose Quintana. Definitely something that we're going to look at when we look at our hitters. The Yankees and Astros game is another one. That game has an 8.5 run total. There's an 8 run total on the Chicago White Sox Detroit game. And then the highest scoring game on the day is that Texas and Toronto game that we mentioned. Like I said, Burley's been a big favorite. So the runs that they're expecting to come in that game are expected to come from Toronto. So that's another team we're going to have to look at some of those bets. So let's get on and talk about some of the starting pitchers. The elephant in the room today is obviously what to do with Max Scherzer. Now, he's gone complete game in his last 2 starts. He's only given up 1 hit in his last 2 starts. He actually has 2 hits in his last 2 starts and has only given up 1. So that's a pretty crazy stat. Last 2 starts, then he's allowed the other team to get against him. Obviously, this guy's dominant. He's been the best pitcher in the National League. He's the front runner for the Cy Young right now. But his price is also very highly up there. If you're playing on DraftKings, he's $14,000 today. If you're playing on FanDuel, he's over $12,000 today. The one place where I think you almost automatically have to put him in your roster is if you're playing over on Aces today. On Aces, he's only $8,250. If you're playing on Aces, to me, it's automatic. Scherzer goes into your roster, whether it's cash, whether it's GPP, whether you're playing a friend. As long as you're not playing low ball on Aces, you should be starting Scherzer because his price over there is favorable enough where you can start him. Now, if you look at those last 2 starts where he's been putting up over 40 DraftKings points, you can even justify using him at $14,000. The problem that you have is not whether or not Scherzer can pay off that salary, which, again, he should be able to. He's going up against the Phillies, one of the worst offenses in baseball, one of the worst against right-handed batters. The one drawback, as people have pointed out already in numerous times, is that the Phillies don't strike out a ton. But, again, the Phillies also don't face Max Scherzer every day. Scherzer is a stud. So if you're thinking about using him, I'm not going to tell you not to. The problem you're going to have is if you use Scherzer, you're really limiting what you're going to get with your bats. He's $14,000. So if you use Scherzer, you basically have to use him with a cheap SP2 because you can't put one of these, $9,000 or $10,000 guys with him because you're basically only leaving yourself about $26,000, $27,000 to get yourself 8 bats. That means that every bat in your lineup is going to be a guy who's $3,000, $3,400. $3,400 will probably be the most expensive bat in your lineup if you go, if you go with something that's kind of balanced. Obviously, you can throw in a big bat if you wanted to, but then you're going to wind up taking 2 or 3 guys that are between that $2,000 and $2,500 range. And I don't know. If you think you can build a lineup that can score you enough points with that, even if Scherzer does get you 40, how much can you really expect out of how many points can you really expect out of a bunch of $2,200, $2,500 bats over on DraftKings? So that's why I said if you're using him, Fantasy Aces, I think he's almost a must include. DraftKings, I definitely can see the merit in fading him. Cash games, I think you can try to squeeze him in if you have a cheap starting pitcher that you like. Definitely think he's going to be a GPP option because I think people are gonna shy away from him. But I don't think you can really build a great lineup around the guy who's going to cost you $14,000. Moving on from there, the pitcher who I have everywhere tonight, the guy who I think is the biggest stud, is Francisco Liriano. He's a -200 favorite going up against an Atlanta team that is missing its biggest bat in Freddie Freeman. Freeman's on the 15-day DL, so that takes him out of the lineup. The other thing about that Atlanta team is they're very left-handed dominant. They don't have a lot of right-handed bats in that lineup, and the right-handed bats that they do have in that lineup aren't all that great. You're probably looking at guys like maybe a Cameron Maybin, a Chris Johnson, and those guys don't really scare me all that much. Most of the regulars, that's like Brzezinski, guys like Johnson, they're all left-handed bats that struggle against left. The game's in Pittsburgh, so it's a good pitcher's park for him, where he only had 10 DraftKings points. But in the 5 games before that, he averaged 30 DraftKings points per start. Every one of them can dial it up. Liriano's a high strikeout guy. The Braves had the 8th highest K rate against left-handed pitching. And that's basically it. He's just shy of 10,000, which is a big, over 20% discount over using a guy like Scherzer. On 2 pitcher sites like Aces and DraftKings. On DraftKings, he's the guy that I'm putting in as my SP1, and then trying to figure out who I'm going to use as my SP2 to pair up with him. You can't use him and Scherzer, in my opinion, because then you're above 24,000 for your pitching. And that leaves you, basically just about 3,000 for each one of your bats. And I don't think you can fill out a lineup that has any kind of upside if you're taking 8 bats that cost, $2,500 to $3,200. But if you use Francisco Liriano as your SP1, there are some guys that you can put in there in the $7,000 to $10,000 range and still leave yourself some options. Because as you can see, when we get into hitters, there are some big hitters that we're going to want in our lineups today. There's a couple other guys I'm going to mention. They all have some upside and they all have some warts, but I do want to mention them because these are the guys that I think most people are going to be deciding between. So let me give you a little breakdown. Johnny Cueto is probably the guy who I think is in the next best spot. The Mets offense has been putrid. We don't even have to get into the numbers. Everybody knows that they've really, really been struggling. The spread here is close, though, which is something that I said concerned me. Him and Syndergaard are going up against each other, and they're both at about a -110, -105. It's been yo-yoing up and down, but neither one of them is a big favorite here. Cueto actually started off, I think, as an underdog at +105 and is now down to -110. So it's been very close. It hasn't been moving a lot in either direction, but again, you would think that Cueto against a putrid Mets offense would be a bigger favorite. And the reason for that is he's coming off the DL. And the thing is, it's not just he's coming off the DL with an injury. He's coming off the DL with an elbow injury. Now, elbow injuries are something that you don't like to mess around with the pitcher. And this is why I probably wouldn't use Cueto in cash. While I do think he should have a good game today, with an elbow injury, you never know what's going to happen. It could be the second inning and he throws a curveball and, his arm just basically goes and he drops to the ground and they pull him out of the game. If something like that happens, you wind up with an inning, maybe an inning and a half, a strikeout or two, no chance for a win, and a score of like 5 or 6 DraftKings points from a pitcher that you paid $10,000 for. Again, in a GPP, I think he's definitely an option. If he does pitch his normal game, he should wind up with 20 to 30 DraftKings points pretty easily against this offense. But again, with the elbow issue being there, I just don't think there's enough safety for me to roll him out in my cash games, especially if you're putting a lot of cash games out there. If you're playing 1 or 2 and you really like him and you think he's the best guy, put him in there. But if you're playing, big money cash games or significant volume of cash games, throwing out a lot of head-to-heads, getting into a lot of 50-50s, something like him tweaking that arm again could ruin your night. So just be careful with it. Like I said, the matchup's great, and I have no problem with the matchup. I don't even have a problem with the price. I'm scared of whenever I hear that a guy has a shoulder or an elbow injury. And again, they gave him an extra day of rest, which means that, he might not be 100% here. They might have him on a pitch count as well. I haven't heard anything about that, but, when you have a stud, you usually try to protect them. So if they get a big lead early, I could definitely see them going to the bullpen and pulling him in like the 5th or 6th inning. So you might not get your usual start out of Cueto today. Another guy who I'm interested in is Taijuan Walker. He's actually an underdog against the Angels, which I was a little bit surprised of. I thought he would be a little bit higher. The Angels are a mid-tier for K percentage in the league, and they're towards the bottom. I think they're 23rd overall in batting average against right-handed pitching. So I was expecting Walker to be a little bit of a bigger favorite. The drawback for Walker, though, is he's always been a lot better at home. If you look at his numbers lately, he's been pitching very well. He's been putting up some big numbers. So, like I said, there are ups and downs to this one. It's a little more fluid. But the thing I do like about Walker, as I said, he's one of those guys you can get in that 8K range. Him and pair him up with Liriano, you're paying about 18K for your pitching. I think you're giving yourself some very good upside, and you're also leaving enough money where you can go get a couple big bats and, not have to take 4 or 5 minimum price guys in order to make it work. Another guy that I wanted to talk about was Corey Kluber. Now, here's the deal. Kluber has not been pitching very well lately. And again, he's not a big favorite in this game. Right now, he's been basically a pick and forth between, -105, being a slight favorite, up to like -115, -110. So they're not expecting him to go out and dominate that Baltimore lineup. Baltimore does have a high strikeout rate, but they also have a high batting average and some good power in that lineup. So again, there's another one that, it's not a slam dunk. There's definitely some risk to it. I think Kluber's a great GPP play. He's always a GPP play because he has that high strikeout rate. He could go out there and sit down 10 or 11 Orioles today, but he also could go out there and strike out 4 or 5 Orioles in the first 2 innings and then, have one of those innings where he gets knocked around a little bit and gives up 4 or 5 runs and, basically takes all the positive points you had and eliminates it on a couple pitches. Vegas does not love him today. He's, basically a pick'em going up against Wei and Chen. So there's definitely a little bit of risk there. Chen's another guy that people have been considering today. I just want to say I am definitely not on Chen today, despite the fact that he has been good. Mostly because despite the fact that Cleveland has a pretty left-handed dominant lineup, they do hit left-handed pitching pretty well. Guys like Brantley and Kipnis have pretty good numbers against left-handers. Have a guy like Santana up towards the top of the lineup. Today's a good day to play a Ryan Rayburn. He's going to be in there, right-hander against the left-handed pitching. And those guys actually have pretty good averages against left-handers. So as a team, they do hit left-handers pretty well, despite the fact that they have a pretty left-handed regular dominant lineup. Next guys I want to talk about and going up against each other. Lackey's a minus 120 favorite over Arrieta, and his price is cheaper, so he talk about a little bit more. As we all know, all season long, the Cubs have a very high K percentage. And like I said, Lackey's the cheaper option at only 7,800. So if you're going to give me the favorite in that game, discount to the underdog, and the favorite, have to say, as a right-handed St. Louis lineup has some left-handed bats. Guys like Wong and Hayward have been hitting very, very well. There has came back as well, so that's another left-handed bat that Arrieta has to deal with. I definitely think that Lackey could have some sneaky. Consider using him in cash. And I know that's a little bit risky if you look at the numbers. I'm not playing a ton of cash games today, but he's definitely a cheap option that I think you can pair with Liriano. And again, you'll be at about a little bit less than 18,000. You'll give yourself enough money to go get some of those big bats. So I definitely think he's someone you should consider. The last pitcher I wanted to talk about is Mark Buehrle. Buehrle has been better than you would have expected, and his price has still stayed cheap. He's one of the biggest favorites on the day at minus 170, third biggest favorite behind Scherzer and Liriano. Goes up against that Texas team that's very left-handed dominant. You got Odor, who's been leading off for them right now, and then you got guys like Fielder, Moreland, and Gallo in the middle of that lineup. Those are all left-handed bats. They don't hit left-handed pitching incredibly well. I don't like the ballpark, obviously. Up in Toronto, there's always a chance for a lot of runs. And as we said, that's the highest run total game on the day with 9 runs. So Buehrle is more of maybe a GPP cheap flyer. But if you're trying to use a guy like Scherzer, I think you can use a guy like Buehrle with him and kind of limit the amount of money that you spend total overall on your pitching and not have to take too many punts to round out a tournament roster. If you really feel like you need to have Scherzer today, which, again, like I said, on DraftKings, I'm not going to argue with you. I do love him. I just think his price is a little high. I wouldn't use Buehrle on any site other than maybe DraftKings. You could probably try it on Aces if you wanted to, but I don't think you need to because I think you can fit Scherzer in over there. So this is pretty much a DraftKings specific kind of play. But if you wanted to go into a tournament tonight and put Scherzer and Buehrle on top, I don't think that's the worst pitching combination you can have. And I think you're going to still be able to round out a decent lineup with it. So that kind of wraps it up for some of the pitchers I wanted to talk about today. We had some pretty good feedback yesterday when we went game by game through some of the pitchers and mentioned some of the batters to take against them. So we're going to stick with that for today as well. Starting next week, we might be breaking it down into segments where, we talk about infielders in one segment, outfielders in a different segment. We'll have them all up on the RotoCurve site for you guys. This way the show will be broken up into parts and it'll be a little bit shorter. It'll make it a lot easier for people who are working in the middle of the day to watch them one at a time and get all the information that they need. But for today, we're going to go with the pitchers and some of the hitters that we can go up against them because people seem to like that the other day on Wednesday when we went through it that way. First guy I want to talk about is William Perez going up against the Pirates. He has a 280 batting average, 3 home runs and 19 innings to left-handed bats. So if you're looking at the Pirates, you want some left-handed bats. A guy like Neil Walker. Walker is very cheap. His prices come down almost all over the place. But whenever they go up against a right-handed pitcher, you're going to see Walker batting usually in the 4-hole in that order. So you're getting a cleanup hitter at a tough-to-fill second base position for a cheap price today in a really good splits matchup. So Walker is definitely somebody who should be on your radar in second base. The other left-handed bat who's kind of cheap and has a good matchup today is Gregory Polanco. He's had some good upside games already this year. And when they face a right-handed pitcher, being that he's the left-handed batter, he tends to find himself up on top of the order in the leadoff spot. So if you can get a guy like Polanco in the leadoff spot today at a cheap price on whatever site you're playing, I definitely think he's another guy that you can consider. And again, we got to find some of these cheap guys today in order to fit in some of this stud pitching. The next guy I'm going to talk about for my man Seth is Kyle Lohse versus Minnesota. In 85 innings so far this year, Loesch has given up 17 home runs. So he's averaging giving up a home run 1 every 5 innings. He's been worse so far in 2015, the right-handed batters. 323 batting average, 10 home runs in 48 innings, and a 142 whip. So there's really only one guy I'm going to be targeting on Minnesota against Loesch, and that's Brian Dozier. Doesn't have a high batting average, never has a high batting average, though, so that's not something that should concern you. That's pretty much the kind of hitter he is. He's hitting about 250, 260 against right-handers, but he does have 10 home runs. So against a guy like Loesch, who's been giving up a lot of home runs, you know, if you're looking for that upside play that I don't think is going to be very highly owned today, I think Brian Dozier is one of those guys that you could put in your lineup. Gives you the chance to get that home run, gives you a guy who's low owned, and, you know, based on the numbers, gives you a guy who's in a pretty good situation here. The next pitcher is Alex Colomé going up against Boston. Colomé doesn't give up a lot of home runs, so you're not looking at the home run hitters in this game, but he does give up high batting average. He has a 275 batting average to lefties, which is, you know, all right. It's a little bit high, but he has a 292 batting average against right-handed pitching. So the two guys who I'm going to be looking at are the two guys that are up on top of that order. That's Dustin Pedroia, who's hitting 312 against righties this year, and Mookie Betts, who's hitting 292 against right-handed pitching. Now, Betts has been on fire lately. He's been hitting the ball left and right. We talked about him on Wednesday, how he had 9 of his last 10 games, he's had double-digit points. So he's cash game safe, and he's been averaging 15 or 16 points a game. So at the price that he's at, he's even a guy who you can use in tournaments. So Betts is definitely somebody who I think should be on your radar. There's a lot of second basemen today, so I like Pedroia less than I like the guys I already mentioned. If you're going cheap, you can get Walker. If you want to pay up, I think you're better off going for a guy like Dozier. But again, all 3 of those guys are in play. Maybe if you're playing on aces and you want to put 3 second basemen in your lineup, 2 in the second base shortstop spot and 1 in the utility, you know, it's an option for you, although I don't usually recommend doing that. Moving on from there, we got Nick Martinez going up against Toronto today. Now, I said Toronto is scheduled, or basically Vegas expects the most runs of any team today to be coming out of that Toronto team. Nick Martinez against right-handed bats this year has given up a 298 batting average with a whip of 160. He normally struggles with left-handed bats, but this year it seems to be more on the right-handers. He also hasn't given up a lot of home runs this year. He's usually a much more home run-friendly kind of pitcher. I think he's only given up about 4 of them so far this year. So guys on Toronto that I'd look to target could look at a guy like Reyes, a guy like Donaldson, a guy like Batista, a guy like Encarnacion. The bat that I really like is Chris Colabello. Colabello has been smashing right-handed pitching. He's hitting over 300, has a couple home runs against them. He's going to be in the middle of that order, so he's going to be able to drive in some runs, get some hits, score some runs. I definitely think Colabello has some upside, and his price is cheaper than those other guys. Reyes, I think, is either the most expensive or in the top 3 or 4 on every site for shortstops. Again, Batista's always expensive. Encarnacion's always expensive. Donaldson's one of the most expensive third basemen. So if you're going to have all those guys up towards the top of the order and they're all going to be very expensive, it's going to be really tough to stack that team, especially on a day like today where if you want to stack that team, you're basically sacrificing all the big-time pitching. You're not getting Scherzer. You're not getting Liriano. You're not even getting guys like Cueto and Kluber and Arrieta. I don't even know if you can fit in guys like a Lackey and Walker, who are about 8,000 over on DraftKings, if you're going up against them. On FanDuel, it's a little bit easier to do it because you can go a little bit cheaper at pitching, put some of those guys in. But even there, if you try to put the Toronto guys in, you wind up looking for like cheap bats in order to round out the the roster that you have put together. So while I do think that they're going to be the best team on the day, and while I do think that you need some exposure to that game, I don't think it's a team that you can stack. I mean, if you could stack them and still get pitching that you like and round out your roster with some cheap hitters when lineups come out later, by all means. I mean, they're expected to score the most runs, but again, they're all expensive. So I don't think you can build a very good roster with a lot of upside around them, because I don't think you can go cheap today. And like I said, FanDuel's the one place you might be able to do it. But think about this. If you're going to do it over on FanDuel, that means you're taking a cheaper pitcher. If Scherzer does go out there and does what he's done the last 2 games, throws up a number of 20, 25 points over on FanDuel, you're really going to need this stack to go off. I mean, you're going to need them. You're going to need every one of these guys to go, double-digit points on FanDuel. Otherwise, you're not going to make up the points that you're giving up on the pitching side. So there is upside to it, but again, it's not going to be an easy thing to do. The next guy I want to talk about is Nicolino. the rookie left-hander from the Marlins. He's going up against the LA Dodgers. Now, this is an interesting game to me because Nicolino struggles a little bit with right-handed pitching. He's really only pitched a couple innings in the majors. But if you look at his numbers in the minor league, obviously he's tougher on lefties than he is on righties. So you got guys on the Dodgers like Van Slyke, 8 home runs and 103 at-bats last year against left-handed pitching. He should probably find himself in the lineup today, but you never know with Don Mattingly. Guy like Justin Turner, who's been on fire lately, another right-handed bat. He's been hitting in the 3-hole for them. Guy like Howie Kendricks. Kendricks has been hitting either 2nd or 5th in that lineup. Again, another right-handed bat. You can look at a guy like maybe even a Kiki Hernandez or an Alex Guerrero. Again, you got to wait till the lineups come out to see if they go really, really right-handed heavy. I don't like all the lefties here. Like I said, Nicolino is kind of tough on lefties. I would prefer to use some of the righties. If you use some of these righties, the guys that we just mentioned, they're not very expensive. You know, Van Slyke, Turner's getting a little bit pricey. Kendricks is slightly pricey. Van Slyke is not the cheapest guy in the world, but you know, you can make a stack of guys like Kiki and Guerrero and Kendricks and Turner and Van Slyke and still have money left over to pay up for pitching. So this might be a sneaky spot for you to look in for some right-handed bats. Again, it's going to depend on the lineup when the lineup comes out. So we got to wait and see how that works itself out. Brett Anderson on the other side of that game going up against Miami. Anderson struggles a little bit with right-handed bats, and there's 3 guys on Miami I'm going to be targeting. Obviously, Giancarlo Stanton, 304 batting average, 9 home runs, and 56 at-bats so far this year against left-handed pitching. So not only is he in play, but he's probably my number 1 option on the day in the outfield. There's another guy we'll talk about in a minute who's in just as good a spot. But again, you know, if you want to fit a guy like Giancarlo in, you're going to have to sacrifice in other spots today. It's not going to be easy to do with the high-priced pitching, but I think that he has enough upside where he's someone you want to look at. Marcell Ozuna, one of his outfield buddies, batting in the middle of that order. Ozuna's hitting 373 on the year against left-handed pitching. So whenever there's left-hander going up there, you definitely got to put him in play, somebody you got to consider. The other guy is a cheap option, salary saver kind of guy that I think people are going to need to use today, and that's Jeff Baker. Depending on what site you're playing on, check it out. He could be first base eligible. He could be second base eligible. I know on Aces, he's a second base shortstop guy that I think a lot of people are going to be using today. He's only $37.50, so he helps you fit in some of those big studs that you want into your lineup. I expect him to be very popular tonight in the qualifier for the live final. Again, he's a right-handed bat, hits left-handed pitching pretty well. Him and Justin Bour are in a platoon split. So when they play a righty, you'll see Bour in there. When they play a lefty, you'll see Baker in there. So he should be hitting 5th or 6th in that lineup tonight. Has a little bit of pop, can drive in some runs, has some guys in front of him that should be getting on base. So I definitely think he's one of the salary savers you want to put on your radar today. Moving on from there, Rick Porcello is another guy. He's struggling lately to guys on both sides of the plate, left-handed batters especially. But Tampa Bay doesn't really have a lot of lefties that you can target against them. The one guy who will probably be up there and is pretty cheap is Kevin Kiermaier. If he's healthy, he's going to be leading off again for them. He tends to lead off when they play right-handed pitching. And he is a guy who can get on base. He can steal a base for you. He can score some runs, has a little bit of pop. I don't love him, but again, he is one of the best targets that you can use against Porcello. And it pains me to say it, but Porcello has not been good lately. I don't think that was money very well spent by the Red Sox. And I say it pains me to say it because him and I went to the same high school. Obviously a couple years apart. I'm a little older than he is. But, you know, as a fellow alum, I wish I could say that this guy's a stud and we should be starting him tonight. But the way he's been pitching lately, I think that they're going to get to him. He's been giving up like 4 or 5 runs in every one of his starts and, you know, basically been giving up a lot of hits, getting knocked around a little bit. I definitely think you can look at some of those Tampa Bay bats. The only 2 I really like are Kiermaier and Logan Forsythe. Forsythe is still pretty cheap. He's been hitting pretty well lately. His batting average is up to almost 300 at the moment. So I definitely think that those 2 guys are guys that you could put on your radar. I like Forsythe where you can find them at like a second or third base option. Places where he's only listed as like a first and second base option, there are much better options on the day to use. Next guy I want to talk about is Trevor May. Trevor May is going up against the Brewers. Trevor May really struggles with left-handed bats. I was surprised when I looked at the numbers. So far this year, Adam Lind is hitting 290 with 10 home runs and 200 at-bats against right-handed pitching. Now, we all know, and even from his days up in Toronto, Lind is very good against right-handers. That's what he does. He struggles when he goes up and faces left-handed pitching. But today he's getting a weak right-handed pitcher, so I definitely think Adam Lind could be one of those cost-saving first base options that can get you a cheap home run and help you fit some of those big bats in. The other guy that I'm really looking at hard is Gerardo Parra. He's either leading off or hitting in the 2-hole when they go up against right-handed pitching. Parra's a left-handed batter, and he's been hitting right-handed pitching pretty well lately. He's very cheap. Again, he's another guy I think on Aces you're going to see a lot of. I think his price on Aces is like $42.50. So I think between guys like him and guys like Baker, you're going to need some of these guys in your Aces lineups if you're trying to round it out for the Q or anything else that you're playing over there tonight. On some of the other sites, his price is starting to come up, but I still think he's in play on FanDuel and DraftKings as well. You don't get a ton of upside with a guy like Parra, but again, he's been hitting the ball. He's been getting a couple doubles. He's been scoring a couple runs. He can steal a base for you. He's not a guy I expect a home run out of today, but I do think that he's somebody that should be on your radar as well. Aaron Harang is somebody who I definitely think we should be targeting against. After the last 2 years, he's had big starts to the season, and he's gone downhill after that. He's given up 6 home runs in his last 4 games, hasn't got past 6 innings in any of his last 4 starts, and has allowed 20 runs over that span. So he's definitely somebody who has been serving it up and giving you an opportunity to, get some upside. The people who have been hurting him the most have been left-handed bats. So going up against the Washington Nationals today, you got to think a guy like Harper's in play. Harper's batting .341 against right-handed pitching with 20 home runs and 168 at-bats. So you're not going to find anybody who has much better numbers than that. And also a guy like Denard Span. Span is hitting .342. He's got 4 home runs and 150 at-bats as well. He's not a big home run hitting kind of guy, though. But he will get you a couple hits. He will get on base. He can steal a base. He can score some runs. And all those things start adding up. So over on DraftKings, those guys are a tad pricey, but I think that you want to try to find a way to fit them into your order. Harper was the guy I was talking about along with Stanton when I said there are 2 big bats I think you want to try to fit in if you can. It's very tough to do it if you pay up for pitching. But if you're going in a tournament today and you want to try to give yourself maximum upside, I think what you do is you start by putting those 2 guys in your roster and then filling out the rest of your roster with bats that you like and then going cheap at pitching. Because you know that a lot of people are going to be paying up for a guy like Scherzer. If they're not paying up for Scherzer, they're going to be paying up for the guys like a Kluber, a Cueto, or a Liriano. So if you're throwing in some short-priced pitching along with some high-priced bats, you're going to have a differentiated roster. Now, whether or not it pays off basically counts on how well those bats do for you. And it also, like I said, this is a tough day because you're going to be fading multiple high-priced pitchers instead of just one. But I definitely think that that's an option that you might be able to roll with. And we'll talk about that at the end when we talk about our cornerstones. A couple other guys I just wanted to mention real quick. Jose Quintana going up against the Tigers. Quintana's been horrible against right-handed bats this year. It's allowing a .304 batting average. The Tigers are filled with right-handed bats. So you got guys like Kinsler, guys like Miggy, guys like Cespedes, guys like J.D. Martinez. All those guys are going to be in play. Now, again, like the Toronto stack we were talking about, it's going to be tough to stack those guys up because they are so expensive. And, the positions that they play, outfield, first base, second base are places where there are a lot of options tonight. So I don't think it's going to be easy to get them into a lineup. But the way Quintana has pitched against right-handed batters, I definitely think that there's some upside there, something that you could look into. The last guy I want to talk about is Noah Syndergaard. Now, Syndergaard's been pretty good. Where he has struggled a little bit has been against left-handed bats. So there's really 2 guys that I want to talk about on Cincinnati. Votto is the high average guy who's, can rack up a couple hits for you. And Syndergaard throws the ball hard. Guys that throw the ball hard tend to give up a few more home runs. Basically, it's a simple theory. The harder they throw, all you got to do is make contact, the further the ball's going to travel. So a guy like Votto could be in for a good game today. The other guy I want to mention is a guy like Jay Bruce. Bruce has been hitting very well lately and has tremendous amount of power. Now, the thing is, though, he's also a very high strikeout guy going up against a high strikeout pitcher in Syndergaard. So for me, this is like a DraftKings only, tournament only kind of play. If you're playing on a site like Aces or FanDuel that takes points away for outs and strikeouts, I wouldn't use Bruce today, even though he does have some home run potential. But over on DraftKings, it doesn't matter if you strike out 5 or 6 times. As long as that 6th or 7th time you hit a home run, you're still going to end up with 14 points. So on DraftKings, I think you can put Bruce in play in some of your tournaments, hoping that he does catch one of those fastballs from Syndergaard and, deposit it in the bleachers over there at the Great American Ballpark. If they were playing this game in Citi Field, I wouldn't be on him at all, but I'm pretty sure they're on the road, so I think he might be a guy that you can use. So that basically rounds it out for the pitchers that I wanted to talk about and the hitters to target against them. You'll notice I didn't talk about any Philly bats because I'm not using anybody against Scherzer. Didn't talk about any of the bats going up against Liriano. Didn't talk about any of the bats going up against Arrieta. Not that I think Arrieta is a guy I want to use or Lackey is a guy I want to use. But remember, there's three places that you put pitchers. Guys you want to target to use, guys that you want to target against, and guys that are in the middle that you don't really want to pick on them, but you're also not going to be using them. You know, the guys like Arrieta and Lackey definitely fall in that middle spot for me today. So like I said, they're not guys who I'm going to get too in-depth about. If you want to use some of those left-handed bats against Arrieta, you know, Wong's been hot lately. Haywood's been on fire lately. I mean, those guys could be in play. On the other side against Lackey, some of the left-handed bats, maybe a guy like a Rizzo. If you're looking for a cheap option like Coughlin, if he's batting leadoff or if he's hitting in the cleanup spot. If you need a catcher, maybe a guy like Montero. But these aren't guys that I'm enamored with today. Like I said, I would put those pitchers in that middle section. Not guys I'm using, but not guys I'm targeting against either. So let's talk about lineup construction today, how we're going to be building the lineups. Francisco Liriano is my keystone pitcher. On FanDuel, he's the guy that I'm rolling out there in cash and in tournaments today. On DraftKings, he's definitely one of the pitchers I'm putting up there as my SP1. Over on Aces, he's my SP2 that I'm putting in with Scherzer. I really like the Liriano and Scherzer combination over on Aces, so I definitely think that's going to be a combo that I'm going to be rolling with. I think both of those guys have upside. They're the two biggest favorites, and I don't think there's any reason not to use them because I don't think that their prices are too restrictive. I still think you can build a pretty decent lineup around them. Maybe not get in every big bat that you want, but you can definitely get in some of the big bats that you want. Let's see. When it comes to bats, you're going to need some of the cheap guys today. So here's a short list of guys who I've been using that I wanted to throw out there to you. There's probably a couple more I mentioned that aren't on here as well. I was just putting it together real quick. But guys like Chris Colabello, Gerardo Parra, Neil Walker, Scott Van Slyke, Jeff Baker, Kevin Kiermaier. Those are some of the guys that you might want to mix into your rosters in order to be able to fit in some of those high-priced pitchers. As far as big bats that I'm going to be paying up for, like I said, the two guys that I'm going to be trying to get in as many lineups as possible are Bryce Harper and Giancarlo Stanton. I think both are in line for a home run. I think both are in line for big upside games. I think both could have high batting averages and, you know, get a couple hits today, drive in a couple runs. I mean, they're two studs, and they're in good spots. So when you get a stud in a good spot, you want to make sure that you roll them out there. I also think you can go for all those Detroit guys. Sneaky play for me today that's always low-owned is Yoenis Cespedes. Again, like you guys know, I'm not a huge BVP guy. I'm not a slave to it, but it's definitely something that you want to consider if something pops out to you. And Mike Rathburn was telling me this morning, he kind of lost his voice, so he didn't do a morning meeting for you guys today. But Cespedes has great BVP today, so he's definitely somebody that I think you might want to look at. Obviously, Miggy, if you can afford him, is another guy that you can put in there. But again, you can only afford so many big bats along with the pitching today without having to go too cheap. So I definitely think that the guys you want to try to get in there are Stanton and Harper if you can. Now, when it comes to tournament strategy, here's what I was saying. There's two ways to look at this. Most people are going to shy away on DraftKings from a guy like Scherzer because he's just too expensive. On FanDuel, I don't think he's too expensive where people shy away from him. So on FanDuel, I think you might want to come off of Scherzer and try to use one of those secondary guys. You know, somebody who's like second to seventh in the pricing altogether. You know, basically anybody from Kluber to Cueto to Arrieta to Lackey to Walker or Liriano. Those are the guys who I think you should use for your tournaments. If you can put together a cash game lineup you like with Scherzer on FanDuel, I think you go ahead and do it. We already talked about pitching on Aces, so basically DraftKings is where we're coming to next. If you're playing in tournaments, you really have two options, I think, to be contrarian today. You can pay up for Scherzer and link him with a really cheap pitcher, and that'll help differentiate your roster. Or you can say, screw all of the top price pitching today and go ahead and take like a Burley as your SP2 and then link him up with an SP1 like a Lackey or maybe a Taiwan Walker and hope that you get enough points out of those guys and the fact that they would leave you enough money to get a bunch of the big bats that you want into your lineup and go ahead and load up on the bats. By doing either of those things, like I said, I think Scherzer will be low owned. So I think if you're going in tournaments and using Scherzer, you're getting him lower owned than you should. And I also think that people will struggle to figure out how to round out a roster with him. So you really got to hit on that good cheap pitcher that you want to use. And I think that can give you some differentiation if you can do that. The other options that I think will give you more differentiation is if you decide not to pay up for any pitching today and go with 2 cheap options. Basically, the way you would do that is build your lineup first, leave your pitching blank, build your lineup first, and then go back at the end and fit in whatever pitchers you can fit in on the low end. I think that most people will at the very least be taking one of those guys from, like Arrieta or above. So if you decide to fade them all, you're going to have a differentiated roster. Again, like I always talk about, though, it's one thing when you're fading like a Garrett Cole when he's the only stud on the day. It's another thing when you're fading Scherzer, Cueto, Kluber, Mariano, Arrieta all together. If you're fading 4 or 5 of those big studs, you got to figure that, at least one of them is going to have a pretty good game today. And if anybody uses that one guy and he gets you, 30 to 40 points, you're going to be behind the 8 ball looking to make that up with, needing some big games out of your bats. So that's basically the way I think you guys should go about it today. Like I said, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties early in the show. My neighbors are doing some work on their house down here at the beach, and every time they turn on the saw, for some reason my house shakes and the internet connection goes out. But we were able to get through the show for today. I thank you guys for coming and checking us out. Josh will be back. Rath and Jason are back from the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. So it'll be back to business as usual. Things will be back to normal next week come Tuesday. I thank you guys for coming. This has been another episode of The Curve. And as always, even though I'm not in my shirt and tie, make sure you guys stay classy, DFS. Good luck tonight.